Glad to see everybody here. Welcome to David Caplan, our featured guest for the day. My name is Lonnie Monka. For those who don't know, this is a Jerusalem event, and Jerusalem is an initiative to foster literary culture in English in Jerusalem and in Israel. And this is part of our efforts to make some move and go online and see how we can explore doing literary and cultural activities online because of the ongoing epidemic and the need for social distancing. So this is the third session now. We have three more sessions coming up every Sunday for the next 3 weeks. We're really happy everybody agreed to participate, especially David, who's with us today. And with that, I just wanted to introduce David, and I hope people had a chance to look. I shared so much online through Facebook and Instagram and through the mailing list, his whole bio. I hope you had a chance to look at that, and you guys check it out again afterwards if you want more details about him. I just wanted to maybe say a couple of things personally. It's been amazing for me to actually meet David here a few times over the last few years. If I remember correctly, it must have been about 6 years or so ago that you were here for Bar Ilan for something. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you ran a workshop, and I got to see you there, and it was just a very deep and heartfelt experience that definitely stayed with me. And then again, last year you were in Haifa University, and while you were here, you came and did a reading in Jerusalem, which was a lot of fun. We also have Linda Zisquid, I saw, came into the meeting. She got to read with you, and it was just a great night. And I'm glad to have gotten to actually meet you here a few times before we connect digitally like this. And yeah, I think a big feature of your poetry, which is just amazing and keeps me coming back to it and keep on thinking, is just the direct address of Jewish experience in an American context and exploring what that means. And I think helping people think about those things and starting conversations about those things. And with all that in mind, I wanted to keep with the concept of this online series was that even though we're connecting digitally and connecting across vast distances, what does it still mean to have a relationship to place? So to start with, before David reads some of his poetry, I wanted to ask a few questions about his relationship to Israel and place in general. So with all that, do you mind first just telling us what is your relationship to Israel and Jerusalem, like as a physical place that you've been coming to? When did you start coming here, and what does it mean for you to continue to visit?
I came for the first time 13 years ago, and when my wife and I were married, we spent the summer in Jerusalem. And then I've come back several times, both to give lectures, readings, to spend significant time. And as Lonnie, as you mentioned, a couple of years ago, I was at University of Haifa for the full year. Before I go any further, Lonnie, I just want to thank you for organizing this event. I'm very pleased to participate and join a really great bunch of poets that you've lined up. So it's an honor, and thank you. Thank you very much.
For sure.
The relationship of place, I can't think of writing a poem without thinking of where it's set. So I know it's poetically, whenever I'm writing a poem, I'm moving characters in and out of places. So my first book, which was In the World He Created According to His Will, has a series of poems set in Jerusalem and around Jerusalem. It's partly for me, I think I differ from some of the other readers that you have, like Charles Bernstein and Erica Meitner, a little bit, in that Jerusalem in particular, but Israel more generally, has a religious pole, and it has a connection through prayer and through a kind of lived Jewish experience in a religious setting, as well as I realize I don't live there. I visit there. Mm-hmm. So I'm part of certain communities, but I'm very much outside of it, and trying to grapple with in those poems, in my first book of Israeli history, that as a Jew I'm part of, but I'm not Israeli. Mm-hmm. So more generally, the poems in my next book, my most recent book, Into My Garden, are set in a Hasidic yeshiva in Morristown, New Jersey. I was interested in that place for the kind of intensity of experience of language and questions of faith that one encounters there. Not so much that they're dictated to the participants or the speaker has received answers that he just accepts, but kind of grappling with these large questions of life. So to me, I guess in some ways, Israel, Jerusalem, uh, in that first book, and for more generally, it seems like, sometimes I wonder if all the, world's solutions and all the world's problems are kind of isolated in Jerusalem. And you go there and you can see how, in religious sense and other sense, this incredible potential and people doing amazing things. At the same time, you have incredible challenges living close proximity to each other. I was attracted to setting poems in this Hasidic yeshiva because of the intensity of the language and the intensity of people grappling with these issues. I think all of us do to greater or lesser degrees, but in that environment, you're focused on it.
So you already touched up on so many things that I wanted to talk about, and maybe just to start and to stay with the focus on Israel, is that it's really interesting for me to hear you say that in your first book there was so much about Israel, and you also mentioned how so many of your poems have clear settings. Because I looked at your new book preparing for this meeting, and I was really surprised because I noticed, like you said, a lot of the poems have very clear settings, and but at the same time, in that book, if I'm correct, there was actually no mention of Israel, which, especially knowing that book was probably written and worked on around the time that when you were visiting, so that was really surprising to me. I don't know if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think it's partly because I had that sequence at the end of the first book, and then I'd been to this particular yeshiva in New Jersey a few times. And I was interested in just capturing the experience of that place. It's always a question now is Judaism primarily a diasporic religion, or religion really of Eretz Israel? And in that, I was interested in what it was like to be in a particular place. I'd already had poems set around Jerusalem. I felt I had I didn't have so many more ideas. Also, one thing I'm struck by is if you look in particularly on English language literature, Orthodox Jews, when they're represented, typically are represented not as fully human. They're either terrible human beings or they're purely spiritual human beings. I live in an Orthodox community. I've very rarely met anyone who's either. Most people are people. And I was interested in trying to capture the fullness of the experience of someone trying to live seriously with religious faith. The speaker in these poems, it's both me and not me. I changed a lot of details so I could write poems. I made him younger than I am. I made him a runner. He likes to go on jogs, so I could have him go on runs and kind of think about things. I don't run unless someone's chasing me. And, yeah, it is striking how, and I think when I wrote these poems, a chunk of these poems, and published them in the Virginia Quarterly Review, and they had a photographer went to the yeshiva with me and took pictures to accompany it, and Stephanie Burt wrote the introduction. And she was really struck by how I'm looking at a kind of particularly American experience. And I guess that's true, and it makes sense. Although at the same time, I'd have to say when I was writing the poems, it was much more practical. I was thinking, this is an interesting setting, interesting idea. Maybe I can write that in a poem. But Lonnie, I do agree that none of the poems were set in Israel, and this is striking given the fact I just spent 2 years ago a full academic year there.
Mm-hmm. So I'm mostly interested from the last thing you said. What was the comment about being American or un-American? And also, just a few people are messaging me because I think your camera's on, but nobody can see you right now, including me.
No one can see me?
Yeah, I don't know if you see yourself, but it's just a black screen for me, and a few people message me. I don't know if anybody else. Do other people see David? Maybe you can give me like a hand raise if other people see him. Very strange.
It's saying my video's on. I'm going to stop it, then I'll put it back on.
Okay, maybe that'll help. But
oh, that is odd.
Well, again, lots of technical the technical difficulties add to the the ongoing awkwardness of literary events. I think it's how
If you'd
stressed
like,
can you get?
I, I can leave the room and come back to it if you want, but I'm concerned that I won't get back in.
I wouldn't worry too much. Again, some people said that they do see you. So maybe, did you put your camera back on now?
I tried to hit stop video, and then I tried to hit it to put it back on. I've been able to see myself the whole time, and now I can't, so I'm not sure what the deal is.
Interesting. Now, yeah, now it seems like your camera is off. I don't know if you want to try in the bottom left there or at least on my screen, it says bottom left is stop or start video.
Give me one moment, please.
Maybe while you're figuring that out, I think I just want to maybe, on the one hand, share this funny personal anecdote and help people understand more about the poems that you're talking about. But one of the things that we connected on the first time that we met actually was I told you that I grew up in Morristown, New Jersey. So you're talking about setting these poems in a Chabad center, which is I think the main Chabad yeshiva outside of Brooklyn for the whole world in Morristown, New Jersey. And I happen to grow up right down the street from there. So I've been exposed a little bit to the places you're talking about, and it's always a fun thing for me to read your poems and feel like an insider in that I know the places that you're talking about and the kind of people you're talking about.
I'm glad. I tried to write these poems that if people knew more about it, they could access it, but if they didn't, that hopefully they could get something out of it too. So. Yeah, I'm afraid now I was seeing my video before, and now I'm not, and I'm not able to load it back on, so I'm not sure.
I just tried sending you this thing that says ask to start video. I don't know if you see that.
I did not.
Maybe we shouldn't have even tried to touch it at all. Well, again, I wouldn't get too caught up on this. I think the important thing is to hear you more than to see you, even though it would be very nice to see you as well.
Okay.
Unless it's important for you and you want to try to hop off and on quickly.
Whatever you prefer.
Now let's just keep talking. So again, you mentioned that someone commented about these poems about the Chabad yeshiva, that they were, remind me now, you said that they were American or they weren't American. What did she say, and what was the idea behind that?
Yes, Stephanie Burt was struck by how American the experience of Judaism is in these poems. That I'm not referencing Israel in them at all. And I think that's right. I think it might have been a little bit more intuitive rather than planned out. In other words, I thought this would make an interesting setting. I had a series of poems I thought would make interesting settings, and I just pursued them. And then at the end, you realize, oh, none of these poems are in Israel. But I think also intuitively, I was thinking about trying to explore the American experience, or at least an international experience of Judaism in America, not based in Israel.
Cool. Well, I mean, I have some more questions, but I think now that we started to talk a little bit about these poems, I think it'd be nice to hear them. So you want to share some?
So why don't I read the title poem, which is titled "Into My Garden." And again, this is set in a yeshiva in New Jersey. Part of the idea you might be helpful to know is the quote is from Song of Songs, Shir Shirim, but really in Chabad Lubavitch, there's an important Hasidic discourse that the last Lubavitcher Rebbe gave on Into My Garden, Balch Lagani, and that's what these boys are studying. In the poem, I'm contrasting a little bit the education one receives in the yeshiva and the education that I received in secular settings. The person I mentioned, the philosopher, just as a piece of trivia, I studied with the philosopher Richard Rorty, who's one of the great postmodern philosophers, and he would talk about metaphysics is dead. And so you'll see my kind of what when he comes into this poem. So it's into my garden. As if New Jersey were Babylon, an Argentine and an Israeli argue in Aramaic, styrofoam cups of instant coffee warm in their hands. Other boys return to last night's commentary. I have come into my garden, back and forth they sing like an invitation. What did I learn in school? Whenever the philosopher lectured on the death of metaphysics, pollen found an open window, pistil and stamen crazed with each other. Yellow, the serpentine walls and columns. Yellow's the library where church belonged. Some nights his best student recited the lecture like a pledge, but nothing changed, not the picture between us, the glass slick with our fingerprints, the envy I felt. Boys dressed like men raced the stairwell as if to the singing, as if to hear what my garden means. 7 generations caused God to withdraw. 7 generations drew him back. All those years of talking, what did I learn? I think that's one of the questions I'm kind of faced in this is all that education. What do you learn? What did I learn from it? And what is the speaker learning in this yeshiva? One issue that I've found too is in religion, in depictions of religious Jews, they're often shown as being harshly critical of Jews who aren't traditionally observant. Particularly in Chabad Lubavitch, that doesn't seem to be true to my experience of it, nor true to my individual experience. I have a poem titled "Even the Thief," and it's from this Gemara that's often quoted in Chabad Lubavitch circles, which the question is, so even the thief prays for success. So the thief is about to rob. So the question is, why is he praying? So if he believes in God, why is he stealing? If he doesn't believe in God, why is he praying? And it strikes me as a pretty profound, interesting question. So I made a little poem out of it, and it ends with someone with a giant tattoo of the Book of Genesis. So this is one moment where I call it the Book of Genesis. I'm clearly trying to explain it to people outside of a narrow circle. So this is the poem. And again, it's the speaker, and he's grappling with, I think, the rigors of yeshiva study. Even the thief. A night of snow no one expected. This late, the study hall sounds different. The same words said again, dark and glowing. A window scratched with its mistakes. Everyone knows God controls the universe. My study partner translates without a pause. Even the thief prays for success. To know what you feel, not what you ought to feel. Is there anything harder? At the airport, a man with the Book of Genesis tattooed down his leg boarded in front of me, and I couldn't help but wonder how it would feel to have those words that close. So partly I think in that poem, when I asked to know what you feel, not what you ought to feel, is there anything harder? I think that's true, at least from my experience. It's true of living in a religious setting. It's true living in a secular setting, to really kind of grapple with what you feel, not what you're told you ought to feel. Also, one thing I liked, what I tried to do in this poem, is ultimately the image of the person living with the Torah close to him is someone with a tattoo down his leg, which from a strictly religious perspective is not, it's forbidden. But I like that the speaker feels, what would it like to be that close to words of Torah, and kind of in some ways longs for that intimacy and connection. Lonnie, how much longer would you like me to read for?
I didn't follow exactly. I was more into the poems than following the time, but I think you definitely have 5 minutes plus. I think you can. And how many more poems did you want to read?
Great. So let me read a few more.
Sure.
This poem is called "Before the City," and so partly what I was interested in is trying to capture the experience of intensity of prayer that you experience in some of these settings, and it's for people who are in some ways preparing all day to pray, but also who bring intense needs, intense desires to prayer. This is set at the Montefiore Cemetery, which is in Queens, which is where the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the last 2 Lubavitcher Rebbes are buried. So partly I wanted that experience of what it's like for these people to go in, have this intensity of connection, and also this intensity of connection with people who aren't alive. There's not a current Lubavitcher Rebbe, or this last one is the current one. There's not going to be a new one that you'll go and you'll, meet in person. So what's it like to go after a death and have this close connection? So it's before the city. Also, one thing is Lubavitchers often, when they fly into New York, before they go to New York, they'll go straight to the cemetery. So the need to be heard does not change. The need to get close. Again, we hear our requests scattered across the grave. The first time we came, we only knew what to ask for, not what to do. Knock before entering to clear some room, fast before knocking. Before the city, before the slow time of waiting, stones crown the two tombstones, a wedding invitation spotted with rain, letter after letter read aloud. Just as the righteous are greater in death, a marriage without children counts backward, the gray light measuring a skylight of torn paper, white stone. So this book also has a sequence of poems about Ezra Pound, the great poet who made broadcasts for the Italian fascists during World War II, was taken to America to possibly face trial of treason. Eventually was put in a psychiatric institute, went back to Italy after the war, after the political pressure died down. Upon arriving in Italian soil off the boat, made a Nazi salute, and then lived basically the rest of his life with Elga Rudge, who's his mistress, who's the great love of his life. Partly I'm attracted to him because he's a brilliant poet, a brilliant literary figure, and someone who had views that were, repellent. And so he's someone that I'm grappling with. The last section of the poem is called After Image Olga, and it's Olga Rudge, after Pound died, remained his staunchest defender. And there was an interesting moment where Susan Sontag said to Joseph Brodsky, the exiled Russian poet, "Do you want to go meet Olga Rudge?" And they went, and they had this weird little meeting. So this is a way of thinking, in some ways, I guess, of modern literature's tangled legacy for me. In some ways, these figures who've, I think, taught me immense things about poetry. On the other hand, I think they're very poor role models on how to live. So this is after Image Olga. After 20 years of hustlers drinking her tea, what is quieter than a gallery in winter? The little girl healed by her father's candle, as if that were all it took. The right words prayed over her, the right light. Old tricks govern the mud, piles keep the pitched word level. Since gossip believe only this story, she'll give them the right words, the right light. Suffering exists to make people think. He wrote in Italian so their daughter would understand, daughter would learn. Understand? The visitor nods again. It is garbage, but she believes it. Unwed widow, the door still bears her name. So partly I was struck by Olga Rudge's like undying devotion. So one thing about these poems, which you might catch, is they're somewhat tricky. They somewhat rely on some knowledge of Hasidic philosophy. I try to make it entrance to people who don't know it. And also like the Pound poems having to do with Ezra Pound. My father passed away this last year, and I was surprised that I wrote a whole bunch of elegies. I basically have a manuscript now. And I tried very much in these poems to write poems that could be much more accessible, that could be grasped without any notes, without any introductions. So I thought I'd read one of these poems, which is not in this book, which is what I'm working on now. And yeah, what I'm struck by also is with my father died he had Alzheimer's, and I wanted to depict a kind person facing a difficult situation and the impact it has upon a family, which strikes me as true to life for people who've gone through this. And in elegies, I haven't really seen that. I haven't seen the kind of family ripple through the family. So this is a poem called Kitchen. It's my It's from this most recent manuscript, so maybe I'll read this and then I'll be happy to answer whatever questions you have. So again, it's kitchen. When my mother asked, "Do you know who this is?" my father turned his head to find the right angle. Pointing, she said the first sound in my name, and the ripped out back wall returned to the kitchen, the tall cabinets of my childhood that I could not reach, a blue ceramic bowl drying upside down beside the sink. All those years I could not wait to get away. David, David, my mother repeated, drawing out the two syllables like a spell. If I am I because you are you, and you are you because I am I, then I am not I, and you are not you, a great mystic taught his students. But isn't it always true of fathers and sons? I am I because you are you, even after the father does not recognize his son, and his son realizes everything in life is learned too late. So again, I'll be happy to answer, I guess, whatever questions you have, and we can go from there.
And wow. Well, thank you so much for the reading, and especially for that last poem. I mean, sorry to hear about your father, and I mean, that one of the things I was even wondering about is what's coming up next, and it sounds like these elegy poems is your new direction. So to move into Q&A, open for anybody who wants to speak, either use the chat box or just kind of raise your hand, or either physically raise your hand or just send me a private message, and we'll see what questions people have and what they want to explore with you. And while we're waiting for any questions, I would actually just love to hear you speak about one more subject, which I think connects to the idea of speaking to people here in Israel and in Jerusalem. Is that something I noticed, and you and I have even talked about this in the past, is your tendency to translate a lot of Jewish words and concepts, and especially Hebrew or Aramaic or any of the prayers, into English. I just want to know if you maybe want to start by sharing a little bit about why that's important for you. And I think it's especially thinking about addressing a group of people that a lot of us are English speakers living in Israel, where I think whenever we're writing, we're asking the same question: what to do with these kind of with this hybrid language and concepts that are foreign for like a general reader.
Yeah. And the real question, I guess, is whom are you writing for, right? So in other words, if I were writing these poems only for religious Jews or only for people in Lubavitch, I would call this book Basi Lagani. I wouldn't call it Into My Garden, because in other words, that would be a reference they get. So in other words, Into My Garden would seem to be explaining too much to them. On the other hand, I'm trying to invite, I hope, the widest audience into my poems. So I don't mind translating them, and then the people who might be more familiar with the term, and it's Hebrew or it's Aramaic, I think they'll do the retranslation in their heads. It's hard because sometimes, though, when you translate a term, it seems insulting to one part of your readership, whereas the other part of your readership would find it difficult without that translation. So my inclination is almost always to translate, except when the word itself has become well known outside of that language. So, for example, like Kaddish, I don't think I would translate Kaddish. I'm more and more likely though to put an endnote explaining what it is. So for people who aren't Jewish, don't have this background, they might have access to it. But to me, it's trying to invite people into my poems. Often, particularly in this last book, the poems I think are theologically difficult. So, I'm not trying to make it more difficult in terms of language. Lonnie, did you have another question, or?
Oh, sorry, I was talking with the mute on. Sorry.
Oh,
I have some more questions, but I see that Yoni wanted to ask. I don't know if you wanted me to read this or if I can unmute you and you want to ask yourself, that'd be great.
First of all, thanks. Wanted to say thanks a lot for your reading. It's great to hear your poetry. I'm curious about. It's kind of a question of the day. And in the past few months, we've been experiencing the COVID-19 epidemic and how that's been unfolding in the American community, American Orthodox community, in terms of community, and also I think grappling with questions of faith. And the impacts that's been having on people around you, but also you personally and your writing.
oh, well, great. That's a great question. So there's several levels to it, right? So
Yeah.
COVID in American Orthodox communities, American Orthodox communities in terms of faith, how they're handling it, how my writing is handling it, and I guess American poetry more generally. Let me begin with American poetry more generally. It's a very political moment in American poetry. The Trump presidency has really fueled people's desire to have a poetry that speaks the contemporary political moment. I think COVID has only intensified that. In American Orthodox communities, I live in Cincinnati, Ohio, which is I guess a smaller Orthodox community. So there's four shuls here and a kollel, so it's not Brooklyn, but Brooklyn is devastated. Here, less so. There's been a whole range of arguments just about practically what we should do. So in other words, the synagogues are still closed. What we've started to do is praying outside, where we have to keep a 6 feet distance and wearing masks at all times. And those gatherings are limited to smaller. So in other words, the minyan I've been going to has about 12, 13 people. I don't hear so much discussion about theologically or in terms of, why this is happening and kind of the whole notion of theodicy, why this terrible thing is happening. You do hear people saying, some people voicing that this may be, some great change in the world that we'll see. I don't know. I find it very difficult to extrapolate a situation where people are in incredible pain and some people are dying and seeing what the good that's going to come out of it. In terms of my poetry itself, I haven't written any poems about COVID, about experience of COVID. I think for three reasons. One, I've been writing it was very odd. I've been writing all these elegies, and then COVID comes along, and elegies for my father. So second, I feel like I kind of resist the urge that poetry needs to directly respond to the most obvious thing that's happening in the world. And third, I guess, as I mentioned earlier, my poems often work with a particular scene. At least as I've experienced, because some of my friends have had, coronavirus and have recovered, but there's no real kind of scene in my mind or tension. It's a difficult situation, but I don't know how to make it poetically interesting. And that could change. I could walk out today and go to the supermarket and something might happen, and I'd say, oh, that if I rework that or do something, it might be an interesting poem. I tend, to resist a little bit this idea too, that poetry has an obligation to respond to the most obvious things that are happening in the world. It's not to say if poets want to write about it, that's fantastic, but that the poetry has an obligation to do so. So some people say, for example, Emily Dickinson's poems, they'll say the worst poems because she didn't write directly about the Civil War. Well, I don't see why I think she's an incredible poet. I love her poetry. I don't see why she has to respond to that one thing because we're saying that should be important to her at that moment. So.
Cool. So you muted yourself, Yoni. Do you have any follow-up or you're good? Great. So
Yeah,
another.
no, I'm good. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. Question, and then Ruth Fogelman has she doesn't have a microphone, so she just typed the question and asked me to read it for you, and she wanted to know how you feel about putting notes at the end of the poems that would be a translation of the Hebrew poems of the Hebrew terms. or if I understood this question, I think she's saying, why not put the Hebrew terms into the poetry and just leave notes at the bottom of the page, or maybe an explanation afterwards?
Yeah, I do the opposite. I used to not like putting notes at all because I always felt the poem should be an experience of language. I didn't like people, giving me little notes. I feel, it's hard to put Hebrew, Aramaic, or Yiddish in a poem if in phrases that you think the readers will not be familiar with. Then there's a certain, and I can understand that too. I can understand why some poets would want to do that, because they say, I'm writing to this particular group. I'm not writing to this other group. So, for example, some African American poets and writers have powerfully said they've stopped trying to write to a white audience. So they've stopped trying to write in a way that they have to explain themselves to white audiences. I could see analogously that poets in Israel or religious poets or poets with who live in a certain language might say, I'm not trying to explain myself to people outside that particular community. The negative of that is you're limiting yourself to that community in many ways. For me, I've gotten more, I've grown to like the strategy more of having endnotes. So I don't like footnotes because I feel like when I read them, always my head's bopping up and down from the poem. Where at the end, it's like some little facts that might help the reader. I think one poet whose work I like a lot, and I'm also friends with, is a poet, Yeshua November, he writes poems about living as a chassid, and that's kind of what he's done. His last manuscript, I talked about it, and we worked out kind of what things needed to be noted. At the same time, sometimes the intricacies of the arguments that we're making might not be fully understood, and that's fine too. Because maybe a poem, to me, I guess, one reason I wouldn't put so many terms that need to be translated, because to me, poetry is primarily experience of language. And maybe that's a kind of interesting, powerful experience of language, to be having these terms that the reader's not familiar with. But that's not the type of poem I'm trying to write. That being said, I could see tomorrow, if I wrote a poem, I could say, you know what, I'm gonna see what happens if I load this up with unfamiliar terms, and what happens. It strikes me as an interesting thing to try.
Sure. And I see Ruth also thanked you in the chat. I think guess that means the answer was satisfactory, and maybe, I don't know, maybe we can look forward to doing some very difficult hybrid language poems, seeing them from you. And then she just followed up by pointing out that maybe not loading the poem up totally with language you don't know, but just putting one term in there.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I guess the question would be that one term would have a charge, right? So there's a poem by Donald Justice titled Men at 40. Men at 40 learn to close softly the doors to rooms they will not be returning to. The poem is this kind of gentle poem. At the end, it says, he talks about the crickets behind their mortgaged houses. And mortgaged is a very different kind of word. And all of a sudden it has a jolt because it's a different kind of language. So I could see also trying to have one word that's from Hebrew or Yiddish or Aramaic and have a kind of jolt to it. I could see a lot of different effects. It really depends upon the poem. I wouldn't want to say, one law would fit everything. It would be more kind of what effect you're trying to have.
You're reminding me of one of the poems that stood out to me the most from the book for a number of reasons, partly because of what we're talking about, and then partly because of my own personal relationship to Morristown, was the poem Tikva Way, which, I'm wondering what was your, what were you going for there? Because for most people, or if you want to read that poem quickly, that could also help contextualize the response a little bit. But just so people understand, maybe what I'm asking is that the title of this one poem is called Tikva Way, which, even though, like I pointed out, that there's little to no Hebrew or other languages in your book, and this is clearly tikva, the Hebrew word for hope, but at the same time, it's a proper name of a street But again, I don't think anybody outside of Morristown who hasn't visited Morristown, New Jersey would know that that's the name of a street. So it's kind of doubly confusing, misleading. I don't know how you would talk about it and what you were intending by including that name in the book, given the, you know, the general accessibility that I think you're usually aiming for.
Yeah, guilty as charged. I mean, I guess that's the problem talking to someone who's a very intelligent, astute reader of poetry, is I throw out generalizations and you're like, aha, but what about Tick-fil-A? Yeah, that's a great question. I like the title Tick-fil-A because I just thought it was, you know, right, so people wouldn't know what tikva meant. Maybe they could Google it. Maybe I would say something in the title, to me at least, would less disrupt the experience of the poem. And then if nothing else, I like the idea that, you know, they're naming streets in Morristown, New Jersey with Hebrew terms to show that they're of that place and not of that place. The rest of the poem, yeah, so as I mentioned, I made this guy a runner, a former high school runner, so I could have him run. And and so partly he's someone who became religious later, and he runs now for pleasure or to work off his frustrations, but not to compete. So I'll read the poem until you'll see. I like to try to contrast his previous life with his current life. And Lonnie's absolutely right. Tick-fil-A is this little weird detail that I think some people might, you know, be struck with or not know. But again, at least for me, in the title, you can like Google it without getting into the poem itself. So Tick-fil-A. And this is, as I understand, this is the speaker remembering how he used to race cross country. Now he's running. He remembers the golf course's last hill, how it felt to sprint it. Even then, he knew how little it mattered. The slogan his coaches shouted, how much they cared. Though they would still recognize his stride. When the widower he visits each Friday repeats the transliterated blessing word by word, the vows open into themselves. It shouldn't be this hard up the long driveway. Each breath insists before it relents. So to me, he's someone who used to compete. Now he's running, it's harder. And I don't know if any of you ever played sports as a kid. I played, you know, and I guess I can call myself that I was mediocre. That might be giving me a little more credit than it was due. It was always this weird moment where you're playing a sport for fun. You look over these coaches, these adults, and they really care about it much more than you do. It's this odd moment. I like this person looking back upon his high school track career and how he had some talent, but in an area that he really didn't care for. And now he's doing this work that he sees as holy, but there's a whole set of other challenges and difficulties involved with it. Yeah, so, but that is one time where I have the title. It strikes me that I like using, now that Lonnie had mentioned, I like using street names that are evocative of places. So for example, in the town that I grew up in, which is a suburb north of Boston, a fifth of the streets were chartered after the Civil War, and they were named for Northern generals, which I did not realize until I went to graduate school. So I have a poem, my first book, with Farragut, Sheridan, naming these places that I have these nostalgic memories of. And if you know much about American Civil War, these guys were butchers. I mean, they were practicing all-out war. So in that, I use the associations of, you know, Farragut Road with Farragut, the Northern general. So
Cool. So thanks for reading that poem, and thanks for those further reflections. I think yeah, I see some people doing some poetry snaps in the video. Also, I just you know, personally, after reading the manuscript, it's interesting to hear you speak about this character that you developed for the persona of the poem, which is something that I really wouldn't have picked up from just reading the book. You know, I don't know you well enough to have known whether this was actually you or not, and I don't think there was any clear indication to me that I noticed of why this wouldn't just be you speaking in a kind of autobiographical way. So yeah, something exciting to go back and read the poems with that lens on. And then otherwise, yeah, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to say to kind of wrap things up before I give some general concluding remarks and remind people about the upcoming sessions?
Well, just I appreciate the time to chat with you and your attention to my work. And I guess the question that's gone through is, right, so how do you think of these words to translate, what to translate? One tactic you might think of is even like thinking of an audience, but even literalizing it. Like saying, I'm going to write the kind of poem that I think this person would like, or this person might enjoy. So in other words, if you're living in Israel, and you're thinking, oh, I'm going to write the kind of poem that this guy down the block might enjoy. Right? That is, same setting, same action, same descriptions. But now I'm going to do the poem, and I'm going to set it for someone who has visited Jerusalem but doesn't live here, or someone who's never been to Israel. Each of those would be a different kind of poem. You'd explain certain things and you wouldn't explain certain things. It wouldn't be a better or worse poem, be different. I guess I would say, depending upon what your idea, you could even try one of those things. Say it's not working. Say you're writing a poem and you're saying, I'm thinking about it like the person down the street. I'm writing a poem that he or she might enjoy. Then maybe try even in your mind saying, oh, I'm going to try to write a poem that a person who's never been to Jerusalem might enjoy, with the same, inspired by the same impulse, and see what happens. For me, it's really trying to work through a particular poem and what that poem demands, rather than any one rule across times and places. So.
Oh, thanks. I think that's we all need to think about that, and especially here we see these different people with, I think just not only in our writing, just the day-to-day life as English speakers in Israel, we're often faced or put into context where people are going to understand different things in a way like that. So it's especially nice to think about how to work on that in our poetry as well, in writing. I'm not sure. Do you have it in you for one last question? It looks like somebody did want to sneak, or no?
Sure.
Seems like he does, but then he said he needs to go. I can't tell. Ross, did you want to ask a question?
Hey, yeah, sorry, I'm just holding a baby. My question was about, I also had a chance to look at some of the most recent manuscript with Lonnie, which was really fun. And I was really curious about the experience of being a Baal Tshuva, or kind of stepping into the religious.
Can ask a question, or?
Oh, you can't hear me.
Lonnie, I think you're muted.
I'm muted, but Ross is definitely asking. I don't know if you could hear.
I couldn't hear her.
Oh wow! And then he's muted again. I'm trying to unmute him. He started off saying he's sorry about the shy question. He's holding a baby right now, and then he started asking about being a Baal Tshuva.
Okay.
Back with us, Ross. Can you hear him, David?
Test.
I can't, because in the box to me is it shows that he's muted. So maybe Lonnie, do you just want to tell me what he's asking?
Sure. Do you want to try to ask the question again quickly, or type it out, Ross, and I'll try to say it back. It's funny that I can hear Ross, but you can't. But let's see if we can make this question.
Lonnie, can you hear me right now?
I hear you, Ross. Sure.
Yeah, the question is about how the depiction of the Baal Tshuva experience is, which is very in between worlds. It's excited about the religious world and also feels not a part of it, and inspired by it, but also distant from it, and remembers his one's past, but also has frustrated by it. So I'm curious, just when thinking about the experience of Baal Tshuva in the poetry, what some of his intentional messaging is about it.
So that was quite a long, complex question that I'm going to try to say back as much as I can. Ross, throw stuff, or feel free to remind me about details from what you just asked. But he asked about the in general Baal Tshuva experience in the poetry, in your poetry, and how it's kind of between worlds. Of on the one hand, I don't remember exactly what the two worlds he was saying are. I think that on the one hand, it's just being it's trying to, on the one hand, enter this religious world, but always feeling outside of it, I think, was the tension he was talking about. And if you could speak about how you see that tension between those two worlds playing out for you in your writing.
That's a great question. It's a very complex question. So I would say a couple of things. The poem is built in and out of several things. So the poem is in and out of, I think, American poetic culture, which doesn't really have much respect for religious faith. It has, sometimes you'll see American literary culture will have respect for issues of spirituality, but very much wants to divorce them from any issues of a kind of lived religious commitment. And I think the poems in this book are full of kind of yearning and trying to figure out these, trying to figure out these questions. Ultimately, they don't come to a conclusion about. But I would say that's also true to my and many people's experience of life, that we don't ultimately come to conclusions about any of these grand issues. We're kind of working through them day by day. So I think Ross is right, as Lonnie, as you paraphrased him, is to my intent, is that you're between these things. But also, like that opening poem, Into My Garden, I'm looking back upon, Richard Rorty saying, metaphysics is dead, and like nothing changes. Like, so in other words, being between these two camps and being a little, not fully comfortable or fitting in either. But I guess just one final question is, does anyone feel that they fully fit into whatever community they live in? In other words, it strikes me that's also just kind of life. With Balch Teshuvas, it's more apparent. But I think all of us, whatever community you live in, feel both a part of it and feel distance from it. And so I think I was exploring that also.
Thank you again for that question, also for your response, David. I think so much of what you said, like I said before, every time you start answering these questions, for me at least, you're adding more depth, I think, to the poems in the book. And if anybody didn't catch on, most of these poems and most of the discussion we're having about David's poetry is his newest book, Into My Garden, out with Ben Yehuda Press. You can check it out online. I've had a lot of fun reading it, and I look forward to rereading it now with this background information. And with all that in mind, thanks everybody also for coming out today for this session. I hope you make it out to future sessions. We also have, I still see Adina's with us. She's actually the reader for next week. If you want to say hi really quickly, Adina.
Hi, everybody. I hope you come next week. Is it going to be 12 o'clock again?
Sure. I think,
New York.
Noon New York time, 7 p.m. Jerusalem.
Okay, very good. Can't wait. Looking forward.
Great. As are we. Awesome. So yeah, please come check out next week. We're going to do another session. We have a few more after that. Also, Listia Ostreicher and Jake Marmer. Thanks for coming out for this Jerusalem meeting, and especially thanks for working with us through these weird technical difficulties. We're still figuring out how to make everything happen. And if you have any more questions, I'll be in this session for another few minutes if you want to talk to me, but I'm also going to just shut off the Facebook feed. And again, one last time, thank you to David for talking to us. And I'll just unmute everybody. A lot of times it gets a little crazy, but now you can kind of all